Paul has been on trial before the Jews and before Felix and before Festus and before Agrippa. And what has he been found guilty of? Nothing. So why is he headed to Rome? He appealed to Caesar. He did that to not have to go back to Jerusalem and be mistreated by the Jews there and maybe ambushed. He appealed to Caesar, and as a Roman citizen he had that right to appeal to Caesar and to go to Rome. As we mentioned last time, apparently he still went to Rome without an accusation. They didn't find anything to accuse him of, and so I guess here's the prisoner. Don't know what he's accused of, but here he is. How does verse... Yeah, that's probably not what the letter looked like. The Romans were pretty good at rewording things. If you noticed, back when Paul was first arrested in Jerusalem, and they're getting ready to beat him, and he said, "Is it lawful to beat a Roman citizen?" The letter that was sent by the Roman commander is, when this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came upon them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And so he rearranged the time frame just a little bit. He didn't know he was a Roman when he swooped in. And I suspect Festus managed to put something on there. What? Probably Nero, at least part of the time when Paul was there. After he got there, it would have been. Not exactly the kind of person that you want to... I mean, he's not real with it anyway. He's kind of unstable. What's significant in that first sentence in chapter 27? Yeah, the word we. Whenever you run into this word we in the book of Acts, that's an indication of that Luke is with them. And so when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, it does not mean that Luke was on trial or a prisoner or anything else, but he was going to be traveling with Paul, perhaps in addition to the capacity as a travel companion, as a doctor, in case there was any need that arose along the way. There was a whole group of prisoners. It wasn't just Paul. There was a whole group of prisoners. They were sent in the charge of a centurion named Julius of the Augustan cohort or battalion. The cohort would have been about 600 soldiers, and a lot of different possibilities of what this could have been. And some people say, oh, he couldn't have been a centurion in charge of 600. It doesn't say he was in charge of the cohort. It said he was a centurion in the cohort. The cohort would have had 6 centurions. We don't have any idea what happened to almost any of them. You know, James we know, and the rest of them, there are a lot of traditions. But as far as the Bible is concerned, it's silent about a lot of those. And that's what we'll run into when we get to the end of the book of Acts. We don't know scripturally what happened to Paul. We don't know scripturally what happened to Peter. James is the only one we know he was beheaded, and the others you get into speculation and how much you want to rely on tradition, and sometimes tradition is probably very reliable, and sometimes it's probably...
Okay, but in secular history,
What's that?
There's nothing in secular history.
In secular history, there would be. Yeah, and not secular history, but religious history, which is vastly different than secular. You know, secular history would be Roman historians and that kind of thing, but there's nothing in those about what happened to any of the Christians, but there would be in Catholic Church history tradition. So they set sail for Italy, and for some reason the Roman government is going bargain here. That's it wasn't uncommon to put passengers on cargo ships, and this first ship was not really a seagoing ship. It was one that would have hugged the coast. It started going up the west coast of what we know as Palestine, and then along the south coast of Turkey. So it would have tried to kind of follow the coastline and not tried to get too far out to sea. It mentions another one of his traveling companions, and who else was with him in addition to Luke? Aristarchus, who was from Thessalonica, Macedonian of Thessalonica. So at least those three were traveling together, Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. And so Sidon would have been along the north of Palestine, on the eastern part of the Mediterranean. How did Julius treat Paul and his traveling companions? They treated him very well. They allowed him to go to his friends, receive care. That's an indication that maybe Luke was along to help with any medical problems he might have. And then they traveled down to the island of Cyprus. They didn't land there. They traveled under the shelter of it. And they just list some of the other cities they hit as they just hugged the coast. But then they needed to go out into the sea, and so they'd have to move to another ship. And so there was a ship from Alexandria that was going to Italy, and they were put aboard it. Where was Alexandria? Alexandria was in northern Egypt. That's where one of the greatest libraries in the ancient world was. And so the Alexandrians did a lot of shipping and travel by sea. And so they switched to this Alexandrian ship. And things are going fine. They're going slowly for a few days. They had a little bit of trouble. And they started going off of under the shelter of Crete. And then what happens? The weather gets a little bit worse, a little bit more challenging. It's getting into October. And what does Paul say to the people in charge of the ship? He says, I perceive, and there's a difference between this and what he says later on. Right now he just says, I perceive. Later on he says something a little bit different about when the situation got worse, and he has more information. But here he perceives that there will be damage and great loss, not just the cargo and of the ship, but also of their lives. Why didn't the centurion pay attention to that? The sailors, the captain of the ship, didn't agree with that. They thought they could make it to a better port. This was not a good port to spend the winter in. They wanted to get to a better port so they could spend the winter in a more suitable place. And so they overruled what Paul was saying, and the centurion agreed that they would go on. So they headed out of that port, and they were going along Crete, and what happened? Now there's a big wind, a violent wind, Euraculo. Up till now, they're doing pretty well. They were kind of trying to make a good port, and it was like this was going to be an easy thing to do. And then this huge wind came up and caught the ship, and they had just let themselves be driven along in it, and they could barely get the whole thing under control, the ship under control. There was a place they were afraid that they were going to run aground in some shallows, and so they let down their sea anchor and allowed themselves to be driven along. Next day there was a violent storm, and what did they begin to do to try to survive the storm? First thing they did was get rid of the cargo. The cargo's not going to do you any good if you don't make it to your destination. And so the first thing they got rid of was the cargo. On the third day, they got rid of something else, and what was that? The sailing tackle. Now, how desperate is that? If you're going to control the ship to where you want to go, you need the tackle, and the fact that they're starting to toss out the ship's tackle shows that they're getting pretty desperate. There's no sun, no stars for many days. How did they navigate back then? GPS? The sun and stars. They used the sun by day and the stars by night to know where they were. And if there is no star or night to navigate by, what are you doing? You're running blind. You're just going wherever. You don't know which direction you're going. You don't know how far you've gone. You don't know if you're going around in circles. You're just going along. And they have given up all hope of being saved. They haven't eaten quite a while, and Paul stands up, and what does he say? I told you so. Basically, he says, I told you so, because he said, you should have followed my advice. You should have listened to me and not left that port in Crete. You've already had a lot of damage. You've lost your cargo. You've lost the tackle. But that's the bad news. What's the good news? Keep up your courage, because the ship's going to be lost, but there's not going to be a single loss of life. Yeah, he does kind of take over control of the ship, giving orders. They wouldn't listen to him before, but by now they're probably pretty desperate. And any port in the storm. Now, before he said, I perceive, but now he's not perceiving. Why does Paul know that they're going to lose the ship, but not people? An angel, and it said, of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, said, do not be afraid. You must stand before Caesar, and God has granted you all these other people with you. Chuck? It really is that his presence or his character or his demeanor has made an impression. If you remember, Don?
I'm just thinking because they've gotten to know his reputation of who he is. He's definitely, they know that he was a Pharisee at one time. And now he's turned and he's a Christian. He's speaking out and telling everybody who Christ is. And he's not being silent about it as he's on the ship, I'm sure.
No.
So I'm sure everybody's had the chance to listen to him throughout
Yeah, I think that's right. If you remember back in the jail in Philippi, and at midnight, what are Paul and Silas doing? They're singing. They're singing hymns. Do you think that had any impact on the jailer when things went bad for him? Yeah, I think just the way they conducted themselves, and they were in a bad situation. They were mistreated. As it turned out, they were Roman citizens who were thrown in stocks without trial and all sorts of things. But just their attitude, I think, reflected, and people could see that.
Something else that kind of sticks out to me too is God always surrounds Paul with the right people. I mean, he has Judas there for him, who trusts him and treats him well, make sure he's taken care of well. He has his friends there, other nurse arts, not every way you pronounce
Yeah.
it, but they're there. They're with fellow Christians. They're encouraging.
Yeah.
They're encouraging each other.
Yeah, and I'm sure they did encourage each other. And there's probably a reason why Julius treats him this way, because Julius is definitely not ignorant of what's been going on. Remember, we point out that centurions are always presented in a favorable light. They're not presented as bad people, evil people. They're Roman soldiers. They're commanders of 100 soldiers. And you would expect writers who are largely Jewish would just let them have it. Centurions are evil empire people. But every single centurion is presented in a favorable light, from the one that was at the foot of the cross, to Cornelius, to the one who sent to Jesus to heal his slave. The list goes on. And Julius is no exception to that. He's an informed person. And so he does treat Paul right because, I think, of the background. And it's no accident that God has set it up this way to make this possible. I don't know if it made any difference or not, but Paul said that an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. It reminds me a little bit of Jonah when they were trying to figure out who was guilty for what, and they found out who Jonah was running from. I mean, these people were idolaters. They were polytheistic. They worshipped all sorts of things. But for some reason, when Jonah told them that he was running from, the creator of the ocean and everything, they noticed. And there's something in this, I think, that causes them to pay attention to what Paul is saying to them. And then in verse 24, what did the angel tell Paul? What's the first thing he said to Paul? Do not be afraid. And it's interesting to notice how many times, even especially right after the resurrection of Jesus, that his followers were told, do not be afraid, fear not. And how many times did Jesus say that during his ministry, whether they were tossed around in a storm or whatever has happened? He told them, fear not, don't be afraid. He was reassuring them. He's going to go to Caesar. It's going to go exactly as God had promised, but you're going to have to run aground on an island. Now we're talking 2 weeks in, and they're being driven all around the Adriatic Sea. And it was apparent that appeared that they were coming close to some land, and they started taking soundings, let down a rope, and measure how deep the water is. And they found it getting shallower from 15 fathoms, or 20 fathoms to 15 fathoms, and they were really afraid they were going to get stuck and cast on some rocks. So they threw out some anchors to slow it down. Then what were the sailors trying to do? They were trying to escape from the ship, and they were going to let the little boat that they used to go back and forth between the ship and the land. The ship wouldn't pull up right to the beach. They would anchor and then get in a little boat to go back and forth whenever they landed somewhere, unless it was a harbor. And so they thought, well, we'll just let this little boat down, and we'll get in the boat, and we will be okay. Now, they said they were going to do some work underneath the ship and put down some anchors and do things like that, but that was not what they were going to do. And so what did Paul say to the centurion? If they leave, you're going to die. You cannot be saved unless these people stay on the ship. Yeah, and that I think that's probably the answer. Down below there, where it's, why is it necessary for the sailors to not escape from the ship and use the lifeboats? Why was it critical that they not do that? Yeah, God had set up the plan this way. God said, this is the way it's going to go, and I'm going to save Paul's life, and I'm going to save the life of everybody on the ship. If the sailors would have let down the little boat and got to land by themselves, they could say, we didn't need any help. Look, we made it by ourselves. And that would have been totally contrary to what God had said. God had said to Paul, I grant all these people who are with you. And so they would have been doing that in disobedience to God's plan. God said that they would all be saved, and not that they would save themselves. And again, you can see how much the centurion trusts Paul by now, because what happens? The soldiers eliminate that possibility. They just cut the rope holding that little ship, the little boat, and let it fall away. Paul turns to them again to encourage them, and what does he tell them? You've been going 14 days. You've been going 2 weeks without eating. You haven't eaten anything. You need to eat some food because they're getting ready to do some pretty strenuous things. He said, don't worry, you're not going to lose a hair of your head. Now, to prove that he really meant it, what did he do? He took some bread and he prayed, he thanked God, and he started eating it. Here's a good example of leading by example. He doesn't just say, you all need to eat some food. He says, we need to eat, and so he prayed to God and started eating. So what did they do? They started doing it too. I just noticed that in verse 34, Paul says, I encourage you. But in verse 36, it says all of them were encouraged. Some of you have a different translation there. Became cheerful. It literally says, well, they became cheerful. For 2 weeks, they've been so upset that they haven't eaten a thing, and Paul, by this gesture, made them become cheerful, and they ate food. And this is where it mentioned before, or Chuck mentioned before, that there were how many people on board the ship? 276 people on the ship. That's quite a few people on a cargo ship. They ate all they needed, and then they tossed the rest of the wheat into the sea. They could tell that they were nearing land, but they didn't know where it was. But they were going to run the ship up on the sand, and then they would have been okay. So they got rid of their anchors, and they headed toward the beach, but what happened? They hit a reef or a high point, and the front of the ship got stuck in that, but the back of the ship could still be tossed around by the waves, and so it began to break out. Now the soldiers have a plan, and what's their plan? Why would they kill the prisoners? Remember that if a prisoner escaped, who got to take their place? They did, the guards. If you have a prisoner who's a murderer and sentenced to death and you let him escape, then you get to fulfill his sentence. If he's going to be beaten or tortured or whatever it is, and you let him escape, or even if you don't let him escape and he escapes, you get to finish his sentence. And so they did not really want to survive the shipwreck and then end up being Roman prisoners because they had allowed the prisoners to escape. Yeah, this, I don't know if we have a picture of a cruise liner or what we have on this, but this is, they didn't have staterooms and little individual rooms and all that kind of thing. But they had to keep track of them through this whole time, through changing ships and everything else. They had to keep track of all these prisoners. Why didn't the soldiers go ahead and kill the prisoners? The centurion steps in, and the centurion wants to spare Paul. He doesn't want Paul to be hurt, and so he says, "No, you can't harm them." Yeah, by now it's obvious that there's one person that he's concerned about. The rest of the prisoners, whatever happens to them happens, but he wants to take Paul through safely, and so that's why he stops them from doing what they wanted to do. And what is his instruction? Grab a piece of the boat. Grab something that'll float. If you can swim, start swimming. If you can't swim, grab a piece of wood or something that'll hold you up, and whatever floats. And out of 276 people, how many of them made it to the shore? They all did? Every single one of them? That's a pretty good percentage out of that many people who all made it safely. And so it was obvious at the end of the day who had saved them. Why were they still alive? Because God did. Because God kept them alive. Otherwise, you would have had some casualties. And so they made it to the island, and they found out that the island is called Malta, or Melita. It talks about natives. Now, natives doesn't mean people running around in loincloths, and natives just means the people who live here, the local people. The local people. How did the local people treat them? With extreme kindness, extraordinary kindness. And it was raining, and it was cold, and they were going to build a fire to help them dry out. So Paul's going to help by picking up some sticks, and he picks up a bundle of sticks, and what happens? There's a viper that comes out because of the heat in the fire, and it fastens itself on his hand. Now, remember that the little snakes over in that part of the world are kind of little, but they're extremely poisonous. And these vipers, you might have 30 seconds before you drop dead. You didn't have enough time to worry about, make a little X and do a tourniquet and do all that stuff. 30 seconds later and you're dead. And so he's dead. And when the local people saw this, what were they thinking? What did they think had happened? This guy must be a murderer. He escaped the sea. He made it in the shipwreck, but Justice, the goddess, Justice, isn't going to let him go. And so Justice is still going to get him one way or another. And so their first reaction is, this guy is a bad criminal, a murderer. And then Paul goes on about his business. He shakes the snake off in the fire, and they just kind of watch. Okay, let's watch him drop dead. And he didn't drop dead, and he didn't drop dead. He didn't swell up. And they waited a long time, and nothing happened. And so what was their decision then? He must be a god. The flip side of what happened in Acts chapter 14, when they were at Lystra, where Paul and Barnabas were in Lystra and healed a man. And what was the reaction of the people there? They started out saying he's a god because he healed them. And then the Jews came in and turned the people around. Then the people said, stone him. And so there they said he was a god, and then they said, kill him. Here's the reverse of that, and they're saying he's going to die because he's a bad guy. When he didn't die, he must be a god. you know that Paul did not accept that because of what he did before. It just doesn't record that, but he didn't encourage them to think of him as a god. The leading man of the island was named Publius, and he entertained them for 3 days and took care of them. But his father was sick. He was bedridden with fever and dysentery. And what did Paul do? Healed him. Went and laid his hands on him and healed him. And then what did the rest of the people do? They bring their people in too. If anybody has anyone who's sick or has diseases, they come and get cured. And so now they're treating them with a lot of respect. And when they got ready to sail, they provided all the food and water and everything they needed when they sailed.
3 months.
They're there for 3 months. I mean, they had to be there basically over the winter because it was not good sailing weather. And so they were there 3 months. Now this is kind of a long, drawn-out trip. To start out with a slow along the coast type thing, and then get tossed everywhere and thrown around in the Adriatic Sea for a couple of weeks, and then crashing on the island, and then spending 3 months there. So it's a pretty long, drawn-out island or trip. They find another Alexandrian ship that spent the winter there, and had the twin brothers for its figurehead. Who are the twin brothers?
I have a little book that says Zeus' sons.
Castor and Paulus. And so they're the sons of Zeus. And they're the protectors, the figurehead. They went on to Syracuse, which is in Sicily. Stayed there for 3 days, and then they went, there's just a little strait between Sicily and Italy. And they went through that strait and stopped in Regium. Reggio Calabria is the farthest southwest spot on the toe of Italy. It's just, if Italy kicked Sicily, this is what would kick it, would be this point right here, Reggio Calabria. There was an American family of missionaries that were a little bit farther northeast of there in Calabria for a few years. There's a church in that same general area still today, kind of north and east of there, a little bit more inland. And so there's still a church presence. It's not the same one from them, but it's a newly revived presence of the Lord's church in that area, as well as on the island of Sicily. They got the right kind of wind, and they sailed around and came to Puteoli or Pozzuoli. And there was a missionary family there in Pozzuoli. They moved in the early 1980s. But there's a congregation of the church there in Pozzuoli. And they found some Christians there, stayed with them for 7 days. And oftentimes in Acts, if Paul stays somewhere 7 days, what's one of the possible reasons that he would do that? Have a chance to worship with the Christians. And so if it was a practical thing, a lot of times he would make it a point to be able to worship to the Christians. And then they headed toward Rome. They went through the Appian Forum and 3 Inns, and Christians came out to meet them from Rome. There were Christians who came out from Rome to meet them in both of those places and accompanied them. And when they got to Rome, how was Paul treated? He had his own private residence. He had to have a Roman guard, but he had his own living quarters. Yeah, that's probably different. I think here, I don't know. I think he started out in this one spot, and then I think this may be the place where he was most of the time or all the time. But this again shows you the kind of character that Paul had demonstrated. Although he was a prisoner, he was only under house arrest and not very strict house arrest. And we know from other passages that Paul was able to reach clear into Caesar's household and into the Praetorian Guard. What do you think this guard heard? This guy's full-time job was to guard Paul. He probably never heard anything about Jesus. Do you think this guard ever heard anything about Jesus? I think he probably heard about Jesus just about all the time. And I think he saw, not only heard about Jesus, but I think he saw Jesus through Paul, living in Paul. I suspect that the guard knew that Paul was there unjustly, that there was nothing he was guilty of.
What I was thinking of was verse 15. We're talking about where he went to visit, but people came in two different locations.
Yeah, they met him along the way. Yeah, he was.
Here, it notes that one group traveled 43 miles,
Yeah.
and the other one traveled 33 miles.
Yeah, the first one was 43 miles out, and so a group came out there and met them, and then another group probably met them at 33 miles, and it's probably a pretty good-sized little group when they went into Rome.
It's really interesting because you have Christians that are excited to see him already, and they know he's coming.
Yeah, there again, that's to walk, probably walk 43 miles. It's a pretty big undertaking, isn't it? Even 33 miles? And that shows how excited they were to see Paul. Now, by now, Paul has not, this is his first visit to Rome. He's probably written his letter to them, but he hasn't been there because he hasn't seen their face yet. He's hoping to see their faces. And so they're wanting to see the person who they've heard about and heard from. And so they do go to all that trouble to go out and meet him along the way. After he's been there 3 days, what does he do? He calls the Jewish leaders, some of the leading Jews in the city. And what does he say? First of all, he says, I didn't do anything wrong. Although I had done nothing wrong against the Jews or their customs, he was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. And so first of all, he says, I'm not guilty of anything. I didn't do anything bad to our people, but still I got turned over to the Romans.
I would imagine that probably word had been, I don't know. You would think that word was gone ahead of Paul, involved with shipwreck and everything like that. I thought maybe the word would went ahead. And Paul would want to tell him right off what is going on, so they wouldn't, they probably heard all kinds of rumors.
Yeah, who knows what news had reached them by now. Some true and some not. And he says there in verse 18, the Romans examined me, and what did they find? Nothing. They were going to turn me loose. But the Jews were objecting and speaking against it, and so I had no choice but to appeal to Caesar. He said, I don't have any problem with the Jews. I don't have any accusation against my nation. And that's why I wanted to speak to you right away. Why is he wearing this chain? For the hope of Israel. What did he say before? When he was before Agrippa and as he was making his defenses, didn't he say the same thing? That I'm here for the hope of Israel. What was the hope of Israel? The Messiah, wasn't it? Wasn't the Messiah the hope of Israel? The promise that was made to Abraham that through his seed all nations would be blessed? Wasn't that the hope of Israel? But they got so bogged down in all their customs and everything, they lost sight of what they were shooting for, what their real hope was. And so as he's done before, Paul points out right away, that's the reason he's there, is for the hope of Israel. It's true, but I find verse 21 very surprising. And why would I find verse 21 very surprising? What do the Jewish people say? We haven't heard anything about you. We have not received letters from Judea about you. None of the Jews from there have come here, and reporter spoken anything bad about you. I find that very interesting because they were behind him all the way. And that 2 years after Felix kept him in prison, 2 years later they were still rabid. And you would have thought they would have sent letters. When they found out he was going to Rome, they would have sent letters to Rome. They would have sent delegates to Rome or something to keep up the trouble.
Only if the accusations were true, right?
Yeah, and I think it would have been risky. They could pull that off in Israel, what they were doing. I don't think they could have pulled it off in Rome. I think if they would have showed up in Rome accusing a Roman citizen of things, it might have been a little bit different. And so they hadn't sent any letters. They hadn't sent any representatives. So Paul goes in with a clean slate, which is good because he didn't have to fight against the false teaching. But they do want to hear about what they refer to as a sect, back in chapter 24. And when Paul appears before Felix, he says in chapter 24, verse 13, that they cannot prove the charges they're trying to accuse me of. But in verse 14 of chapter 24, what does Paul admit to? According to the way that they call a sect, I serve the God of our fathers, believing everything, verse 15, having hope in God, and so forth. And so he says, they call it a sect, we call it the way. But the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem say, we don't know anything about you, but we do want to hear about this sect because it's spoken against everywhere. And we do know bad things about this group. He scheduled a time when they would show up at his house in large numbers. What was Paul doing when they showed up in large numbers at his house? This wasn't just a little hole in the wall that they allowed Paul to live in. They solemnly testified about the kingdom of God. And what did he try to do? What do you think Paul did? He tried to persuade them concerning Jesus using what source? The law and the prophets. From morning to evening, all day, every day, Paul was using the law and the prophets to try to convince them. And Jesus opened the mind of his followers and told them and demonstrated that everything that was prophesied about him in the law and the prophets was fulfilled. Now, at what point in Paul's life would we have said, this is getting pretty bad, I just quit? If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Yeah, and that was important, that things happened along the way to keep his confidence up. Otherwise, if we would have been in his situation and would not have had that, there probably would have been a number of times when we said, I'm just going to throw in the towel because this really isn't worth it. He's going about his own business. He checked with the leaders of the church in Jerusalem to see the best way to go about this, to not stir up trouble. He did all that, yet the Jews have him arrested and he's wrongly accused, and one thing after another, and he doesn't deserve any of it.
One of the main things that I see out of this book is I see Paul all the time. He stays focused with God, but he does have moments where he's probably wondering what's going on. God always surrounds him because he's drawing near to him with brothers and sisters in Christ. He was always getting encouragement from somewhere. That tells me that as brothers and sisters in Christ, we've got to be encouraging each other to have, fight and get right.
Was Paul selected for this job from his mother's womb? Yes. Was he inspired? Yes. Was he superhuman? No. Paul was a human being. And Paul ran into the same, I think he ran into the same shortcomings we run into, that it was, it'd be discouraging. I think you're right, that God put him with Christians that could stand up there, or an angel would reassure him, or Jesus would reassure him. Somebody would reassure him at times like that, because he was not superhuman. Teresa?
Well, I was just keep thinking that he had a mission to fulfill, and he was zealous for that mission. And yeah, he might have gotten down like us, we get discouraged. I think it's okay to sit back for a little bit, but not for very long.
Yeah.
Because then we've got to catch our second breath. We've got to keep going. We've got a mission.
Yeah, it's human to, to have moments of weakness. But of course, we don't have available to us the same things Paul did, do we?
Not in the same way he did,
But we still, through the encouragement of the Scriptures, through the encouragement of each other, we have the same sources of strength that Paul did. We serve the same God, we have the same mission, and they may take a slightly different form, but we have the same sources of strength that Paul did if we just use them, instead of just throwing up our arms and say, oh, woe is me, just feel sorry for me, I can't do this anymore, I'm getting tired. Paul, I think, always just played on the reserves that God gave him, his fellow Christians, and his reliance on God and prayer and all those things. And I don't think we have been shortchanged in any of those. We just think we have. And so we don't rely on it, and we don't have the strength that Paul did. But Paul was on this mission, and it didn't matter if he was in chains or technically a prisoner, he was preaching from morning to night. That's what he did. What was the response on the part of the Jews? It was mixed. Some were persuaded, some weren't. So they couldn't agree. And so they decided to part ways. And this is something that happened on his missionary journeys too, that sometimes people would maybe say, come back next week, we want to hear more about this. In the meantime, the Jewish leaders or the Jews would start stirring up trouble. But this time they didn't really say, come back next week. Some of them, they just decided to disagree.
So you don't see him going out and plotting to kill him, though.
Yeah, there aren't any of them that take an oath to not eat or drink until he's dead. And so they do have a little bit different approach. And then Paul, as they were leaving, Paul said that the Holy Spirit was right when it spoke through Isaiah. And go back to Isaiah chapter 6 to see the whole thing. The part that Paul quotes is verses 9 and 10 of Isaiah 6. And God said, go and tell this people, keep on listening but do not perceive, keep on looking but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull and their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and repent and be healed. Jesus used similar language at various times. But it was apparent that God was not making these people not hear the message. It was their own hardness of ears and eyes that was resulting in this. And so, yes, their ears were dull. Yes, their eyes were blind. But it was not forced on them. It was their choice. They did it. Why did Paul choose these words? Why did he choose this passage to quote as they're splitting?
very fitting.
Isn't that what the Jews were doing? And it was very appropriate for the situation that those who were refusing to listen were the fulfillment of this same message. You have a group of Jews, and some of them are believing and some of them are not, what's the difference?
Their hearts.
Their hearts. And so there are some of them who just have hard hearts, dull ears, insensitive hearts. And so it's an appropriate Old Testament quotation. But I think it's interesting, the context of that. Isaiah describes himself in verse 5 as a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips. And he thinks, I've seen the King of Kings and I'm dead. I'm a dead man. And so when the seraphim took coals and touched his lips and said, your iniquity is taken away and your sin is forgiven. And then in verse 8, what does the voice of the Lord say to Isaiah? You can erase some of the stuff off your mirror with the lipstick if you want to have room to add this, because this should take precedence on your mirror. The voice of the Lord said, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And then I said, here am I, send me. And so this happens to Isaiah, and God says, who shall I send? And Isaiah says, here I am, send me. And God says, oh, by the way, these are the people you're going to be going to. It's not going to be a picnic. It's not going to be an easy deal. When Saul first took on this mission, it said that he had been shown all the things that he was to suffer for Christ's sake. He went into it with his eyes open, and he knew that everybody was not going to obey the gospel. He knew that he was going to be mistreated and beaten and all these different things. And yet he went ahead and did it. And so you wonder about our excuses just because people don't listen to us. They have dull ears and hard hearts and so forth. Well, that's what we expect. So that's a good excuse to not be sent to them, right? Who shall I send? Here I am. Send me. And so in verse 28, back in Acts chapter 28, because of your reception, and this is what Paul did many places, he went to the Jews first. But let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will also listen. And so many of them have rejected the gospel, and so he's going to take the gospel to the Gentiles, the salvation. How long did Paul stay there in Rome? 2 full years. And we don't know, historically, we only know by tradition, whether he ever appeared before Nero or not, or whether this was another emperor that disappeared and somebody else took over. We don't know what happened after that 2 years. It was in his own rented quarters. It was his own place. People came and went. And what did he do openly and unhindered? He preached the kingdom of God. He taught about Jesus Christ. For 2 years, oh, poor Paul, he was arrested and sentenced and sent off to Rome unjustly. He didn't deserve to do any of this. And all that did was gave him an opportunity to spend 2 years preaching the gospel in Rome. You know, look back at the letter to the Romans. I sure hope to get to come to you on my way to Spain. I hope I get to pass by there. No, he got to spend 2 years there, but he didn't have to get there by himself. The Roman government took him and left him there. Is this the end of Paul's life? From his other letters, no. But as far as the historical record, we don't know what happened. We know that he wrote some of his letters while he was in prison, but some of them apparently after he was out of prison. The tradition is that he was released after the 2 years, later on was sent back to Rome, and that time that he was executed. But there's no scriptural support for that. But this is not the end of Paul's life. This is just where the book of Acts ends, because It's probably when Luke wrote it. Luke probably wrote it right now, or he would have included other stuff.
It ends there because that's the end of the mission statement that Luke sent out at the beginning of the book to write about.
Yeah, this is the fulfillment of Jesus sent his apostles, and he said that you will preach the gospel in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and the remotest parts of the earth. And he has arrived at the capital of the world. Rome is the capital of the world. You know the saying, all roads lead to Rome? Well, all roads also go out of Rome. All the roads that go in go out. And so anything that was established in Rome had the opportunity to go to the whole world. So this is the fulfillment of that mission statement that Jesus gave to them, because from here it was a simple matter for the gospel to go into the whole world. It's an amazing coincidence, isn't it, that this just happened at a time when Greek was a universal language and the Roman government had built all these really neat roads. In the fullness of time. What's that? They did need a little bit better boat, but hey. Thank you very much. That was all part of the rigging, I think. Yeah,